Hello, we are so excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Welcome back to the English journey. Today, we are discussing a topic that is both a warning and a beautiful reminder, the fact that life is short. My name is Anna, and I am here to guide you through how to live with more presence and purpose.
And I am Abel. I'm so glad to be here with you, Anna. We often spend our days waiting for the perfect moment to be happy or to start our goals. Today we want to talk about why now is the only time we really have, and how to use English to express what truly matters to us.
That is such a perfect way to frame today's episode, Abel. And I want to begin by asking you something very simple. When was the last time you stopped, just completely stopped, and thought about how much time you actually have left in your life?
Honestly, Anna, I almost never think about that. I'm always thinking about what I have to do tomorrow, what I did not finish yesterday, what is coming next week. I do not really sit down and think about the total amount of time I have.
And that's completely normal. That's actually the default setting of most human beings. We live as if time is this unlimited resource, like water from a tap that will never run dry. But today, I want to give you a perspective that changed how I see my own life. And it involves a very simple piece of mathematics.
I love when you bring numbers into it, Anna, because it makes abstract ideas feel very real. So, what is the mathematics of a human life?
So let's think about this together. The average human life in many parts of the world is approximately 80 years. Now, 80 years sounds like a very long time when you say it out loud. 80 years. It feels enormous. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to convert those 80 years into weeks. When you do that, 80 years becomes approximately 4,160 weeks. That's it. That's the entire container of a human life, 4,160 weeks.
Wait, when you say it like that, it suddenly feels very small. Like, if I took a piece of paper and drew a small box for every week of my life, the whole page would represent my entire existence.
Exactly. And that visual is so important. There's actually a writer named Tim Urban who made this exact visualization. He drew a grid of boxes on a page, and each tiny box represented 1 week of a human life. And when you look at that drawing, you realize something very uncomfortable. You realize that if you're 25 years old, you've already used approximately 1,300 weeks. If you're 35, you've used about 1,820 weeks. The boxes that are already gone are gone forever. You cannot get them back. And the boxes that remain are finite. They're limited. They will run out.
That image is so powerful and a little bit frightening, to be honest. I remember when I turned 30, I thought, okay, I'm still young, I have so much time. But if I look at the box visualization, I've already used more than a third of my total life. That's a sobering thought.
It is sobering, but I want to be very clear that this is not meant to make you feel sad or anxious. The purpose of this perspective is not to create fear. The purpose is to create clarity. When you understand that your time is genuinely limited, your relationship with that time changes completely. You start asking different questions. Instead of asking, what do I have to do today? You start asking, what do I want to use this week for? And that's a very different question with a very different quality of answer.
I think that distinction is really important, Anna. The question of what do I have to do feels like a burden, but the question of what do I want to use this time for feels like a choice. It feels like I have some power.
And you do have power. That's the whole point. Now, let's bring this into the context of learning English, which is something so many of our listeners are working on right now. I talk to learners all the time who say, I'll really commit to English when I have more time. Or they say, I'll start speaking confidently when my grammar is perfect. Or they say, I'll join that conversation group when I feel ready. And what they're really saying without realizing it is that they're willing to trade their limited boxes of time for a feeling of safety that may never arrive.
That's such a good point because I did exactly that for years. I kept telling myself that I would start speaking English more seriously when I felt more confident, but the confidence never just appeared on its own. It wasn't waiting for me somewhere in the future. It only comes from actually doing the thing you're afraid of.
Which brings us perfectly to the second major theme of today's episode, and this is something I call the waiting trap. The waiting trap is a psychological pattern that almost every human being falls into at some point in their life. It's the habit of postponing the things that genuinely matter to us because we believe that some future version of our circumstances will be better, safer, or more convenient than our current circumstances.
The waiting trap. I like that name because it really does feel like a trap. Like on the surface, waiting seems completely reasonable, right? You're just being responsible. You're just being patient. But actually what's happening underneath.
What's happening underneath is a very subtle form of self-deception. When we say, "I'll do it later," we're making an unconscious assumption that later is guaranteed. We're assuming that tomorrow will arrive, that next month will come, that next year we will still be here with the same opportunities and the same health and the same relationships. But life doesn't make that promise to anyone. History is full of people who were waiting for the right moment and then discovered that the right moment had already passed them by.
That reminds me of a story about my uncle. He worked in a very demanding job for his entire career. He always said that when he retired, he was going to travel the world. He had a whole list of countries written in a notebook. He was going to visit Japan, he was going to see the fjords in Norway, he was going to spend a month in Argentina. He kept that notebook for decades, and then 3 months after he retired, he was diagnosed with a serious illness and the travel became impossible. He never opened that notebook again.
That story is heartbreaking, Abel, and unfortunately, it's not rare. It's a story that happens in different forms to people around the world every single day. Your uncle's story illustrates something that the philosopher Seneca wrote about more than 2,000 years ago. Seneca was a Roman philosopher who lived around the time of the Emperor Nero, and he wrote a famous essay called On the Shortness of Life. In that essay, he made an observation that is just as true today as it was 2,000 years ago. He wrote that it's not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. He argued that life is actually long enough if we know how to use it fully. The problem, he said, is that we allow so much of it to pass by in distraction, in delay, and in activities that do not truly feed us.
Seneca wrote that 2,000 years ago, and it still applies perfectly today. That's remarkable, and honestly a little bit unsettling because it means this isn't a modern problem caused by social media or busy schedules. This is a deeply human problem.
It is a deeply human problem, and recognizing that actually makes it feel a little more forgivable. We aren't failing to live well because we're lazy or because we don't care. We're failing to live well because our brains are wired in certain ways that make presence very difficult. And this brings us to the third big concept for today, which is the psychology of busyness.
Oh, this one feels very personal for me. I'm someone who is almost always busy. My calendar is always full. I'm always running from one thing to the next. And for a long time, I actually felt proud of that. Being busy felt like proof that I was important and that I was doing something with my life.
And that feeling is very, very common, especially in modern culture, particularly in Western societies and increasingly in cultures all around the world. Busyness has become a status symbol. If you ask someone how they're doing and they say, "Oh, I've been incredibly busy," there is often a subtle tone of pride in their voice. Being busy has become associated with being successful, with being needed, with being valuable.
Yes, exactly. And I noticed that if I tell someone, actually, I have had a very slow week, I took some time to rest, I sometimes feel a little embarrassed, like I need to explain myself, like slowing down is something I have to apologize for.
That cultural pressure around busyness is something that psychologists have studied quite carefully. There's a researcher named Brené Brown who talks about how busyness can actually be a form of numbing. What she means is that some people fill their schedules to the absolute maximum, not because they truly need to, but because slowing down feels dangerous. When you slow down, you have to sit with your thoughts. You have to confront your feelings. You have to ask yourself whether the life you're living actually reflects your values and your desires. And for many people, that confrontation is so uncomfortable that they would rather stay busy as a way of avoiding it.
Wow,
That is a really uncomfortable thing to hear, but I think it is true. There have definitely been moments in my life where I took on extra projects or filled my evenings with activity, not because I genuinely wanted to, but because being alone with my own thoughts felt too quiet.
And the silence is where the important questions live. The question of who am I becoming? The question of whether I'm spending my time on things that actually matter to me. The question of what I would regret if this were my last week. Those questions only get asked in the quiet. And if we're always busy, we never have to hear them.
So how do we break out of that pattern? Because I understand the trap intellectually, but changing the behavior is a different thing entirely.
The first step, and this is something very practical that you can start today, is what I call intentional pausing. An intentional pause is a moment that you deliberately create in your day where you stop all activity and you simply notice your experience. And one of the most beautiful ways to practice this is through something called sensory description. This is also a wonderful exercise for English learners because describing your sensory experience requires you to use rich, precise, and beautiful vocabulary.
Can you give me an example of what that looks like in practice? Because I want to understand how to actually do this, not just understand the theory.
Absolutely. Let us use a very ordinary moment that almost everyone experiences. Let us talk about having a cup of coffee or tea in the morning. Now, most people drink their morning coffee while they are reading their emails or scrolling through news on their phone or mentally planning their day. The coffee is in their hand, but they're not really present with it. They're not truly tasting it or experiencing it.
That is definitely me. I honestly could not tell you what my coffee tasted like this morning because I was already mentally at work before I even left my kitchen.
So here's the exercise. Tomorrow morning, when you make your coffee or your tea, I want you to sit down, put your phone in another room, and spend just 3 minutes with that drink. And as you sit there, I want you to describe the experience to yourself, using as much detail as possible. Notice the warmth of the cup in your hands. Notice how the steam rises in slow, delicate curls. Notice the color of the liquid, the way the light catches it. Bring it close to your face and notice the aroma before you even take a sip. Is it rich? Is it bitter? Is it slightly sweet? Is there something woody or chocolatey in the smell? Then take a slow sip and notice the sensation on your tongue, the temperature, the weight of the flavor, the way it spreads.
You are making me want coffee right now, Anna. But I also understand the deeper point. What you were doing is using all 5 senses to anchor yourself completely in a single present moment. You were not in the past, you were not in the future, you were completely here in this 3-minute experience of drinking coffee.
Precisely. And that practice of sensory presence is actually one of the oldest and most respected forms of mindfulness that exists. Buddhist meditation teachers have been teaching exactly this principle for thousands of years. They call it beginner's mind, which means approaching each ordinary moment as if you are experiencing it for the very first time, with curiosity, with openness, without the assumption that you already know what this moment has to offer.
I love the phrase beginner's mind. It also connects to language learning, because when you're learning a new language, you are always in beginner's mind. You are always encountering words and phrases that are fresh and new to you. There is a kind of innocence to it that native speakers sometimes lose.
That's a beautiful connection, Abel, and it's one reason why I genuinely believe that learning a new language is one of the most life-enriching things a person can do, not just because of the practical communication benefits, but because it forces you into a state of presence and attention. When you're learning English, you can't be on autopilot. You have to listen carefully, you have to choose your words deliberately, you have to pay attention to nuance. That level of attention is actually a form of mindfulness.
I had never thought of language learning that way, but it makes complete sense. Okay, I want to go back to something you touched on, which is the idea of mental time travel. You mentioned not going to the past or the future. Can you explain what you mean by that in more detail?
Yes, absolutely. Mental time travel is a term used by psychologists to describe the human brain's remarkable, but sometimes unhelpful ability to project itself into different points in time. Our brains can visit the past through memory, and they can visit the future through imagination and planning. And this ability is genuinely one of the most extraordinary things about human consciousness. It's what allows us to learn from our mistakes, to make plans, to build civilizations.
But there's a downside to this ability?
There is a significant downside, and it's this. Most of us spend an enormous percentage of our waking hours living in either the past or the future, rather than in the present moment. Studies in psychology have shown that the human mind wanders, meaning it leaves the present moment, for approximately 47% of all waking hours. Nearly half of your life is spent somewhere that doesn't actually exist.
47%? That means that if I live to 80 years old, I will have spent approximately 38 years of my entire life lost in my own thoughts, either replaying the past or rehearsing the future. That's more than a third of my entire life spent somewhere that doesn't actually exist.
And the researchers who conducted that study, Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard University, also found something very important. They found that people reported being less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were focused on what they were doing, even if they were doing something quite mundane or routine. They were happier when they were present with that activity than when their minds were elsewhere, thinking about something more pleasant.
So presence itself is a source of happiness, independent of what you are actually doing. That's a remarkable finding.
It is remarkable, and it is also deeply practical. It means that the path to a more satisfying life does not necessarily require changing your external circumstances, getting a better job, moving to a new city, finding a new relationship. Sometimes the most transformative thing you can do is simply to change the quality of your attention in the life you are already living.
That is both incredibly comforting and also, in a way, a little challenging, because it means I cannot blame my unhappiness on my circumstances. I have to look at how I am relating to those circumstances.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective from my life needs to change to my attention needs to change is one of the most empowering realizations a person can have. Now, I want to move into a topic that I find deeply important, and that is the quality of our relationships. Because when people talk about what they value most at the end of their lives, when researchers study people who are elderly or seriously ill and ask them what mattered, the answer is almost never about work or achievement or money. It is almost always about the people they loved and the quality of the time they spent with those people.
I believe that completely, and I have noticed in my own life that when I'm under a lot of pressure or I'm very busy, the first things that get neglected are usually my close relationships. I cancel plans with friends, I give shorter answers to messages from people I care about. I'm physically present with my family, but mentally, I'm still thinking about work.
That pattern is so universal and so costly, and we often do not realize the cost until much later. There's a researcher named Robert Waldinger who leads what is called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. This study has been running for more than 80 years, and it is the longest study of adult happiness ever conducted. They followed hundreds of men from their teenage years all the way through old age, and they tracked their health, their happiness, their relationships, their careers. And after all those decades of data, the single clearest finding was this: good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. Not wealth, not fame, not professional success. Relationships.
80 years of research, and the answer is relationships. It seems almost too simple. But I think the reason it seems simple is that we intellectually know it is true. The harder part is actually living that truth, actually prioritizing relationships when everything else in our busy modern lives is competing for our attention.
And the quality of those relationships matters enormously. What the study found is not just that having relationships matters, but that the depth and the warmth of those relationships is what actually predicts happiness and longevity. People who had many shallow social connections, but few deeply intimate ones, did not show the same benefits as people who had even just a few truly close, honest, and caring relationships.
So, life is too short for shallow relationships. That is actually a really radical idea in a world where we are encouraged to network, to collect followers, to maintain hundreds of online connections.
The research is saying that the depth of connection matters far more than the breadth of it.
That is exactly what the research is saying. And this has very direct implications for how we use language, including English. Think about the difference between a shallow conversation and a deep one. A shallow conversation sounds like this: "How are you?" "I'm fine, thanks. And you?" "Good, thanks." That exchange takes about 5 seconds and leaves both people feeling exactly the same as before they spoke.
Yes, we've all had thousands of those conversations. They're almost like social rituals that we perform without any real information or connection being exchanged.
Now think about what a deeper conversation sounds like. Someone asks, "How are you really?" And the other person feels safe enough to say, "Honestly, I've been feeling a little lost lately. I've been questioning some of my choices and wondering if I'm on the right path." And then the first person says, "Tell me more about that. What has been on your mind?" That exchange, which might take 5 or 10 minutes, has the potential to change both people. It creates a moment of genuine human recognition. It says, "I see you. You are not alone in your confusion or your struggle."
And English learners sometimes feel that they cannot have those deep conversations because they don't have the vocabulary or the confidence. But I think the willingness to be honest is actually more important than having perfect grammar.
That is such a wise observation, Abel. And I want to say this very clearly for everyone listening. The most powerful thing you can do in any language is be honest. A sentence like, "I don't know how to say this perfectly, but I want you to know that I'm grateful for you," is infinitely more meaningful than a grammatically perfect but emotionally empty conversation. Vulnerability in language does not require advanced vocabulary. It requires courage.
I want to share something that happened to me a few months ago that really changed how I think about this. I have a very old friend, someone I have known since we were children, and for years we had drifted apart. We were both busy. We would occasionally like each other's photos on social media, which felt like maintaining the friendship, but actually meant nothing at all. And then one day, I read a news story about someone who had died very young, someone around our age, and I was deeply affected by it. So I picked up my phone and I called my old friend directly. Not a message, not a voice note, an actual phone call. And when he answered, I just said, "I miss you, and I'm sorry I've let so much time pass. I want to hear about your life." And we talked for almost 3 hours.
That is a perfect example of what I mean by using the awareness of life's brevity as a catalyst for action. You could have told yourself, "I'll reach out to him soon." You could have waited for a convenient moment or for the right words to arrive. But instead, the awareness that time is limited made you pick up the phone and make that imperfect but completely genuine call.
And it reminded me of something important. The friendship was still completely alive. It had not disappeared. It was just buried under layers of busyness and assumption. We had both assumed the other one didn't have time. We had both been waiting for the other one to reach out first. And all of that time, all of those years of distance, had been completely unnecessary.
This is why the phrase "life is too short" is not just a cliche that people say after something bad happens. It is an actual operating principle that, when you truly internalize it, changes the daily decisions you make. Life is too short to leave important words unsaid. Life is too short to let a misunderstanding with someone you love sit unresolved for weeks or years. Life is too short to spend your Sunday evenings dreading Monday morning without ever asking whether you are doing work that aligns with your values.
And for our English learners specifically, life is too short to wait until your English is perfect before you start using it to build real connections and have real conversations. The language exists to connect human beings to each other. Using it imperfectly in service of genuine connection is infinitely better than waiting in silence for perfection that may never come.
Beautifully said. Now I want to talk about something that I think is one of the most powerful motivators for living intentionally, and that is the concept of legacy. Legacy is the word we use to describe what we leave behind, the impact we have on the world and on the people around us after we are gone. And thinking about legacy is not morbid or depressing. It is actually one of the most clarifying things you can do.
I have heard people talk about legacy in the context of very famous or powerful people, like politicians or artists or scientists, but can ordinary people also think about their legacy?
Not only can ordinary people think about their legacy, I would argue that the legacy of ordinary people is the fabric of human civilization. Think about your grandparents or your great-grandparents. They were not famous, they were not in history books, but they made decisions every single day that directly led to you existing, to you sitting here and listening to this podcast and learning English and thinking about how to live a meaningful life. That is an enormous legacy. They probably never thought of it as such, but that is what it is.
I find that very moving, actually. My grandmother passed away several years ago. She never went to university, she never had a famous career, but she was the person who first told me that learning languages was a form of freedom. She said, "Every language you speak is a door you can open that is invisible to people who do not speak it." And that single sentence has influenced how I have lived my life. That is legacy.
That single sentence your grandmother said is a perfect example of how words, chosen carefully and spoken with love and conviction, can outlive the person who said them. Your grandmother is gone, but her idea lives in you. And now that idea is living in everyone who is listening to this podcast today because you just shared it with them. That is how legacy works. It is not always about monuments or books or great achievements. Sometimes it is a single sentence spoken at the right moment.
So thinking about legacy is not about being grandiose or self-important. It's about asking yourself, what do I want to leave behind in the small, everyday interactions that I have with the people in my life?
Exactly. And there's a very powerful exercise for this. I want you to imagine that you are at a gathering where people who know you well are speaking about you. Maybe it's a birthday celebration, maybe it's a retirement party, maybe it's something more solemn. And the people who love you most are describing what you meant to them, the kind of person you were, the way you made them feel. What do you hope they say? Not what you think they would say right now, but what you genuinely hope they would say about the life you have lived.
That question makes me a little emotional, honestly, because I think what I would want people to say is not, "Abel worked very hard," or "Abel had a very successful career." I think I would want them to say, "Abel made time for the people he loved. Abel listened when you needed someone to listen. Abel made you feel like you mattered."
And now, here's the follow-up question, and this is where the exercise becomes truly powerful. Is the life you're living right now, the daily choices you're making, the way you spend your time and attention, is it pointing in the direction of those words? Is the gap between who you are being and who you want to be small or large?
That's such an honest question. And I think for many people, including myself, the honest answer is that the gap is larger than we would like it to be. We know what we value, we can articulate it beautifully, but our calendars and our habits do not always reflect those values.
And that gap between stated values and lived behavior is what the psychologist Rollo May called the existential gap. It's the space between the life we are imagining and the life we are actually living. And the good news, the genuinely hopeful news, is that this gap is not fixed, it's not permanent. Every single day offers hundreds of small opportunities to narrow that gap, to make choices that are just a little more aligned with the person you want to become.
That's the hopeful message. It's not about a dramatic, total transformation overnight. It's about small, consistent choices. Choosing to call a friend instead of scrolling. Choosing to spend 10 minutes on your English lesson instead of watching one more video. Choosing to sit with your coffee for 3 minutes and actually taste it instead of rushing to the next task.
Small choices repeated consistently are how lives are built. We tend to overestimate what a single dramatic gesture can do, and we vastly underestimate what small, daily, intentional choices accumulate into over months and years. If you spend 15 minutes a day learning English, that's more than 90 hours of English learning in a single year. 90 hours of genuine practice will transform your ability, but 15 minutes a day sounds so modest that most people dismiss it.
It's the compound interest of behavior. Small investments, made regularly, grow into something extraordinary over time.
And the same is true for relationships, for health, for any skill we want to develop.
The mathematics of small daily choices is one of the most underappreciated forces in human life, and it connects directly back to where we started today, which is the perspective of time. When you look at your 4,000 weeks and you understand that each one is precious and finite, you stop waiting for the big moment and you start honoring the small ones. You stop saying, "Someday I will," and you start saying, "Today I will," even just a little.
I want to bring up something that I think a lot of learners feel, which is a kind of guilt when they think about all the time they have already spent waiting or being distracted, or not learning as consistently as they wish they had. There's a temptation to feel regret about the past, and I think that regret can sometimes be paralyzing.
This is such an important point, and I'm so glad you raised it, because the perspective of life's shortness can sometimes tip into anxiety or regret if we're not careful. And both of those emotions, anxiety about the future and regret about the past, are forms of mental time travel that take us away from the only place where change is actually possible, which is the present moment.
So the answer is not to feel guilty about the time that is past, but to honor the time that remains by using it differently.
Precisely. There is a very compassionate and wise phrase from the mindfulness tradition, and it's this: begin again. It's two simple words, and they carry an enormous amount of wisdom. Begin again means that no matter how many times you have drifted away from your intentions, no matter how long you have been waiting, no matter how many English lessons you skipped, or how many important conversations you postponed, this moment, right now, is an invitation to begin again, not from a place of shame or self-judgment, but from a place of fresh commitment and gentle self-compassion.
Begin again. I love that. It doesn't say try harder or do better or you should have started sooner. It just says, here's a new moment and it is entirely yours. Begin again.
And every new moment truly is an invitation. Every morning you wake up is a set of boxes that have not yet been filled, and you get to decide with intention and awareness what goes into them. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but consciously and with the understanding that these boxes matter.
Before we wrap up today's conversation, Anna, I want to ask you something that feels very personal. Has thinking about the shortness of life changed something specific in your own daily behavior? Something concrete?
Yes, it has, and one change is very simple. I used to end phone calls with my mother quite quickly. I was always half focused on something else, already thinking about what I needed to do next. And after really sitting with this idea of finite weeks, I made one simple commitment. When I speak to my mother, I am completely present. I do not look at anything else. I listen to everything she says. I ask follow-up questions. I let silences sit without filling them. And those conversations have become some of the most nourishing parts of my week. My mother has not changed. The length of our calls has not dramatically increased. What has changed is the quality of my attention, and that has changed everything.
That is a beautiful example because it requires no extra time, no dramatic life change. It is just a quality of attention applied to something that was already happening.
And that is the heart of everything we have discussed today. You do not need to quit your job, move to a new country, or completely rebuild your life to begin living with more presence and purpose. You need to bring more consciousness to the life that is already yours. You need to look at your finite boxes of time and ask yourself whether the way you are filling them reflects what you genuinely care about.
I want to offer a small summary for our listeners because we have covered so much ground today, and I want to make sure the key ideas are clear. First, we talked about the perspective of time and the idea that 80 years translates to roughly 4,160 weeks, which helps us understand that time is a genuinely limited resource that deserves to be treated with care and respect.
Second, we talked about the waiting trap, the very human tendency to postpone the things that matter most until some future moment that is more convenient or more perfect, a moment that is never guaranteed to arrive. Seneca knew this 2,000 years ago, and it is still one of the great challenges of human life.
Third, we explored the psychology of busyness, and we considered the possibility that for many of us, staying extremely busy is not a sign of productivity, but a way of avoiding the quiet where the important questions live. True intentional living sometimes requires us to slow down, to create space, and to be willing to sit with the discomfort of genuinely examining how we are spending our time.
Fourth, we practiced the idea of sensory presence and daily gratitude, using simple moments like a cup of coffee or a walk in nature as opportunities to anchor ourselves completely in the present, and to use rich English vocabulary to describe what we experience, making both mindfulness and language learning into the same beautiful practice.
Fifth, we discussed the power of presence, backed by the Harvard research showing that our minds wander for nearly half of our waking hours, and that presence itself, independent of circumstances, is one of the most reliable paths to genuine happiness and satisfaction.
Sixth, we spoke about social connections and the 80-year Harvard relationship study, which confirmed what many wisdom traditions have always taught, that deep, warm, honest relationships are the single greatest predictor of a long and happy life. And we discussed how English can be a vehicle for deepening those connections, not through perfect grammar, but through honest and courageous expression.
In seventh, we explored legacy, the idea that our small daily choices in the words we speak with care and intention can outlive us and continue to influence the people we love long after we are gone. Asking, "What do I want people to remember about me?" is one of the most clarifying questions we can carry through our days.
If there is one single thought I want to leave with every person listening today, it is this. The life you are hoping to live is not waiting for you somewhere in the future. It is available to you right now, in this moment, in the quality of your attention, in the courage of your honesty, in the decision to begin again. Your time is limited, and that limitation is not a tragedy. It is an invitation to treat each day, each conversation, each cup of coffee with someone you love as something genuinely precious.
And for everyone who is on this English learning journey with us, please remember that every sentence you speak, every word you look up, every conversation you bravely enter is a small but real act of choosing growth over comfort and connection over isolation. You are not just learning a language, you are learning to tell the world who you are and what you care about, and that is one of the most meaningful things a human being can do.